There we go. So the floor is yours.
All right, awesome. I'm going to share. See if I can do that. All right, let me know if that's good.
So far.
All right, cool.
Yep.
All right, awesome. Well, thanks for joining me tonight. I am Adam Driscoll. I'm the founder of Ironman Software. I am a PowerShell MVP. I've been really involved with PowerShell for the past, I don't know, 8 years, 9 years. And today we're going to be talking about PowerShell Universal. So a little bit about the company. We make a bunch of stuff kind of centered around PowerShell development or PowerShell usability tools, productivity tools, that kind of thing. I actually started kind of my PowerShell days with PowerShell tools for Visual Studio. That's kind of how I got into PowerShell. And then from there, I built PowerShell Pro Tools. PowerShell Universal is what we're going to be talking about today. And then I just released PowerShell Commander, which is another cool little tool that we offer. So about PowerShell Universal, the idea is that you can build full-featured web apps with PowerShell. And it's kind of broken into three major feature groups. First are APIs that allow you to expose PowerShell scripts as REST APIs. And then there's automation, which allows you to execute and schedule PowerShell scripts. And then finally, there's Dashboard, which is kind of a evolution of Universal Dashboard, which is a PowerShell module I released about 4 years ago now, that allows you to create interactive web pages with PowerShell. So we've kind of merged that PowerShell module into PowerShell Universal, and we're going to show off a little bit about that today. A little bit more about the list of features that are available underneath each of these kind of feature groups. APIs allow you to do like static and dynamic routing, multiple HTTP verb support. You can even upload and download files, and rate limit. Automation has things like scheduling, deep integration with like PowerShell features. So things like pipeline and feedback, parameter block support, that kind of thing. Dashboard is, like I said, an evolution of Universal Dashboard. It uses a lot of the same kind of concepts and that kind of thing. It's just hosted inside the PowerShell Universal platform. So you can still build the same thing that you could build in Universal Dashboard, similarly in PowerShell Universal. So you can do things like charts and forms, tables, dynamic web pages using WebSockets and that kind of thing. So it's kind of our ultimate customization component. And then the platform itself kind of allows you to do all different kinds of things over the top of those different feature groups. So we provide authentication that integrates with things like just basic forms auth, single sign-on, Windows Auth, OpenID Connect, and WS Federation for things like Okta and Auth0 or Azure AD, that kind of thing. Role-based access, so you can kind of determine who has access to what resources in PowerShell Universal. So we're kind of enhancing this a little bit, but you can kind of assign roles to dashboards and APIs. And in our 1.6 release, you're going to have a lot more control over who has access to what automation scripts. And one other thing I want to touch on is the script-based configuration. So everything is kind of configured via PS1 files. We have a really nice admin console, but it generates PS1 files, and that's how configuration is persisted. So you can actually kind of, check your PS1 files into a Git repository, and then spin up a new PowerShell Universal instance and just configure it with those Git files or PS1 files. So we're going to kind of go through how that works, both from the admin console side and the script side today. One question I get a lot about PowerShell Universal and Universal Dashboard is what is the difference? So I don't know. I think if I did it again, I would have called PowerShell Universal something slightly different because it's a little bit confusing. But the idea was that it is kind of an evolution of Universal Dashboard and offers APIs, automation, and dashboard, while Universal Dashboard was just, the single feature. It did offer APIs, but now we've kind of broken it out, so it's a little more, well-defined, I guess. So some key differences are that PowerShell Universal is a standalone ASP.NET Core web application. So it doesn't actually run directly inside PowerShell like the PowerShell Universal Dashboard module did. because of this, we can do things like multi-environment. So that means we can support multiple versions of PowerShell or multiple PowerShell instances that are configured slightly differently. So we definitely have customers that are running Windows PowerShell dashboards as well as PowerShell 7 dashboards, and dashboards that have particular modules loaded in them while others don't. So one of the problems with the PowerShell module universal dashboard was that everything was loaded in the same process, which could cause a lot of conflicts between modules and that kind of thing. PowerShell Universal includes the Universal Dashboard V2 and V3 modules. So V2 was the kind of the web framework that was inside Universal Dashboard, and V3 is the new web framework we've developed alongside PowerShell Universal, to support a lot more controls and make it way easier and less buggy, I guess. And then PowerShell Universal has a lot of stuff kind of based around authentication and authorization, job persistence and scheduling. So we actually have a small database file that we use to actually store file output or job output and pipeline output. And then you can do scheduling and run as support. So it's a little more full featured than Universal Dashboard, and it's more of a platform rather than a PowerShell module. So PowerShell 1.5 is kind of the latest and greatest in the PowerShell Universal ecosystem, I'd say. So see, some of these are the new features that came with PowerShell 1.5. So we've done a lot of work to the table. We added Mac OS support. We have server level caching. You can customize the login pages. We've made the configuration system way more resilient, that kind of thing. So we've added a lot of stuff into 1.5. That said, as of, I think, yesterday, we released the first 1.6 beta version. So that actually has an entirely rebuilt admin console. I don't know if I have a slide for this. Not yet. And we'll kind of look at 1.6 at the end of this presentation. So I actually have a 1.6 instance up and running, and we'll poke around at the admin console and look at some of the cool features in there. So with that, I am going to jump into a demo. So those are most of the slides that I think I want to do. All right, so I kind of want to talk about like where to get PowerShell Universal. If you go to our download page, it has links to all the different places that you can actually find PowerShell Universal. So obviously you can just kind of click on these and it'll download the various artifacts. We have a Windows MSI installer that will install it as a Windows service. We have a Windows zip that allows you to just run it standalone, which is what I'm doing right now, and I'll show you how that works. Or you can actually use that zip to install the IIS. We have Linux and packages similar to the zip that are just built for Linux and Mac. And then we have Docker containers for lots of different flavors of operating systems and different versions of PowerShell 7 installed in those Docker containers. And then finally we have Chocolatey, so that will actually install the Windows MSI if you want to just use Choco install to get that up and running real quickly and automatically directly from there. So that actually is automatically updated whenever we release new versions of PowerShell Universal, thanks to Stevie Coaster. All right, so what I am running here is I actually have two versions of PowerShell Universal that are up and running right now. Like I said, all I did was I downloaded the zip file and extracted it to my desktop here. And I literally just double clicked the exe file and started up PowerShell Universal. One thing to note is when you do download a zip, you have to make sure you unblock all the files in here. Otherwise, you might run into some problems on Windows. You wouldn't have to do that on Linux or Mac. So from there, once you start up PowerShell Universal, what it's going to actually list out is the port it's listening on, and by default, it's going to be listening on port 5000. So when you first start it up, you're going to see a window like this, and this is just the PowerShell Universal login page, and you can use admin and any password to log into PowerShell Universal. So as long as nothing is broken, it's going to log into the admin console. And I don't know why it's so slow right now. All right. All right, so here's our admin console. This is the 1.5 admin console. And like I said, in 1.6, we actually kind of did a big refresh on this. So I'll be showing that later. But it's kind of broken down into the various feature groups. So we have APIs, automation, dashboard, and then general kind of system settings. APIs are your REST endpoints that you can actually create inside PowerShell Universal, and then set things like rate limits. You can configure things like authentication and authorization, which roles can actually execute these endpoints. Automation is the script scheduling and kind of ad hoc script running portion of PowerShell Universal. So you can create scripts. They're just regular PowerShell scripts. There's no need to actually adjust your scripts just for PowerShell Universal. We actually have a bunch of features, which I'll show off later, that allow you to kind of integrate deeply with the PowerShell, hosting environment to expose things like parameters and that kind of thing. And then dashboards are kind of the evolution of Universal Dashboard. So as I said earlier, you can use multiple frameworks. We actually allow you to create multiple dashboards. So you could have one dashboard running the older 2.9 framework or one running the 3.0 framework. And you can also integrate with other custom components that people have built. So you can see we have some that come in the box, like charts, the code editor, the map, and the style component. But you can also have access to the marketplace to actually download components that other people have built. And finally, there's just like general system settings that you can set for PowerShell Universal. So
Really
one
quick,
thing that I
Adam,
like to kind of, sorry.
Someone asked for a font bump.
Oh, yeah, sure. Beep. Is that better?
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. All right, so one thing I like to demonstrate about PowerShell Universal, because I think it's like a very core piece of, well, before I do that, I'm actually going to show you the PowerShell Universal VS Code extension. So I think I should bump this too then probably. So this will help me demonstrate kind of one core concept of PowerShell Universal, and that is the script-based configuration for everything. So what I have installed here is the PowerShell Universal extension. You can just get it from the VS Code marketplace. So you can just search for PowerShell Universal there. And then once that's installed, you're going to have this PowerShell Universal option inside the activity pane. And when I click that the first time, what it's going to actually do is, if you haven't configured PowerShell Universal at all, it will automatically connect to PowerShell Universal because it's going to use the default username and password. It's going to automatically create an app token for you. And then as you can see here, it just connects to PowerShell Universal, and you'll have access to all your resources directly in VS Code. So if we pop back to our console, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to come in and create an API. So I'm going to click create new API here. Just need to. All right. And I am just going to say hello. Now, once I click that, what's actually going to happen in the back end is it's going to create a PS1 file and add some code to it for this particular API. In this example, I just want to return some text. So I am just going to say hello world and save that. All right, so now this API is saved, and you can see on the right-hand side here, we have things like an example of how to invoke this API, as well as this little run button. So if I click that, you're going to see that hello world is returned, because it actually went out and invoked that REST API via the web browser here. But if I were to copy this and come over to my VS Code instance, I can actually paste that invoke REST method here, and hello world is now output. Now, if I click on the left-hand side here, you'll see I have this API section. If I click refresh, you're going to see that your APIs are actually available directly inside VS Code. And one thing that I want to show is, if you click this button here that says open endpoints.ps1, it's actually going to open this file endpoints.ps1, which is located kind of in our default data directory. This is a configurable directory, but by default it's stored in program data. And you can see here that we have this new PSU endpoint call that defines the URL as hello, and then the endpoint value is hello world. So that's the text that we're actually returning from this endpoint. So the idea is that this PS1 file actually controls the configuration of PowerShell Universal. So we do a lot of like caching internally. We're not reading this PS1 file every single time or that kind of thing, but we use this file to define the configuration for PowerShell Universal. So as an example of that, what I can do is I can edit this file. So if I were to actually add some exclamation points there and go back to my admin console, you're going to see the admin console automatically update because it noticed that file changed and it updated this this particular endpoint internally. And now when I call it, you're actually going to see that I have those exclamation points returned. And the same holds true for my invoke REST method. So it's actually updated that endpoint inside PowerShell Universal just from updating this PS1 file. So that's cool because you can actually integrate with like things like Git. We actually have a Git synchronization service built into PowerShell Universal. So you can actually deploy PowerShell Universal instances that are pretty much read-only. And then through pull requests, you actually update your PowerShell Universal instance, similar to what you would see in like Azure Functions or something like that, where you actually, you have a dev instance where you develop this and then you push it to production via the Git sync. And you don't actually have to touch the admin console if you don't want to. So for the purpose of this example, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through and add some more API endpoints and kind of show you some of the features of the API, and I'll do that via the actual PS1 file here. So you may notice that I am editing this file directly. We also support remote editing. So if you did want to hook up to a remote instance and edit it inside VS Code, we can do it over the PowerShell Universal Management API. So it'll actually go out and update it that way, so you don't have to actually edit it locally necessarily. So you may notice that right here I'm returning a string. But what's kind of cool about Universal is you can also return objects. So in this example, what I'm doing is I'm adding a new URL, which is the computer info URL, and I'm calling get computer info, which is going to return an object that contains a bunch of information about my computer. So I just can save that file. And if I come over to my APIs over here, you'll see that computer info now shows up, and I can click insert invoke REST method to the console, and gotta go to the right console. All right, let's see here. Try that again. All right, so now I have this invoke REST method. I'm going to be calling the computer info REST API, and I'm using the get method to call that. And you'll notice when I call this, it takes a second because get computer info takes a second. And you can see that I have all this data returned from my REST API. And you'll notice that this isn't just a string anymore. It's actually a serialized object, because if I do something like, I think it's OS status, it's actually going to allow me to access those properties. So what PowerShell Universal is doing is it's actually looking at the object that's returned. If it's a string, it's just going to return the string. But if it's like a PS custom object or some other type of object, it's going to use pretty much convert to JSON to take that object, convert it to JSON, return it via the REST API. And then if you use something like invoke REST method, it'll turn it back into an object on the other end. So you got to be a little careful about what you return from here, depending on, JSON serialization rules and that kind of thing. But more or less, you can return objects from your endpoint and then have them kind of rehydrated as objects on the other end, sort of thing. So what's cool about this as well is that you don't have to use PowerShell on the other end. So your client could be, just curl command or something like that on a Linux machine, and you can still invoke PowerShell remotely over HTTP and return kind of a structured object back via the PSU endpoint. In addition to actually returning data, you can also send data with methods like the post method for HTTP, so the verb post. I'm creating a new endpoint here, and all this endpoint is doing is it's going to be echoing out the body of the HTTP request. So it's just an automatic variable that's added to your endpoints. We have a couple of them like headers and cookies and that kind of thing. In this case, the body is just a string that you can use to actually get what was posted via the HTTP request. So if I save that, you're going to see that my hello has appeared here. And if we call invoke REST method, this time I'm going to use the post method, and I'm going to specify a body of hello. And what that's going to do is it's going to echo back whatever I say. So if I were to just kind of edit this, you can see that it's just taking that body and then returning it as a result of the post method. So you can imagine you can use this for updating status of things, sending things from services that don't actually need or have PowerShell, that kind of thing. We actually have a customer that is a trucking company, and they use this extensively to collect data from their computers on their trucks. So they have these embedded systems that you can't install PowerShell on because they're embedded systems, and they actually report over HTTP their location, and then they use a SQL server to store that data, and then they use the universal dashboard map control to actually see where their trucks are, like physically. All right, so a couple of things I want to show off in terms of APIs are the ability to create kind of dynamic APIs that can accept other types of data. So one common thing to do with REST APIs is to provide like a variabilized route. So for example here, this particular endpoint is what I would call a variabilized route in terms of it having this :ID. So the URL is process/:ID, and this ID will accept any value at that part of the route. And then that value will be passed in as the ID variable into your endpoint. So if I wanted to, check a process based on ID on this target machine, what I can do is invoke the REST method with that process ID. So since I'm running all this locally, when I invoke this REST method, it's going to look up the process ID of this PowerShell prompt and then return the name of that process ID back to me. And you can see here that I'm running PowerShell 7.1, so it returns PWSH. Similarly, you can actually access things like query string parameters. So rather than having a predefined route parameter such as this one, you can see here that I've just defined process without any variabilized route components. And what I'm going to do now is actually use a query string parameter. So rather than using the /PID, I'm doing $ID equals PID, and what that's going to do is pass that ID variable into my endpoint. So similarly to the previous example, except that this is a little more freeform. So you can add 0 or more of these query string parameters and then have them show up inside your endpoint. And now you can see PWSH is returned from the invoke REST method because it got the ID from the query string parameter. And then finally, like I said, there's some other features of the HTTP web request that you can access. And in this example, what we're actually doing is accessing the headers of the HTTP web request. And I'm going to call this one process headers. And you can see here that I'm, again, not using a variabilized route or anything like that. And then I'm just accessing the headers hash table that's automatically provided. That's going to include all the headers that are passed with this HTTP web request. So you could get things like the user agent string or information about the client calling the web request. So in this case, I'm actually going to be looking for this ID. And I can pass that in with invoke web request via the headers parameter, and it accepts a hash table of all the headers that I want to pass in. So if I hit enter there, you can see it works the same. I just accessed it via headers rather than via the query string parameter or the variableized route. So again, if I refresh this, you're going to see that my APIs are showing up. And this is actually being populated, or this is being retrieved from the PowerShell Universal Management API. So it's actually calling over HTTP to return these things. And it's actually the same API that we use for our PowerShell module, as well as our admin console. So if we were to actually go back to our admin console and go back to where our APIs are listed, you can see all my APIs are now available in the admin console. So in this way, you can see that our kind of configuration goes both ways. You know, if you edit something inside the admin console, it shows up in the PS1 file. If you edit something in the PS1 file, it shows up in the admin console. We do have a one-way get sync that allows you to set the admin console to read only. So you can actually view stuff in here. You can run jobs, but you can't really edit anything. And then you can do everything through the PS1 files. All right, so now that we talked a little bit about endpoints, let's jump into some automation stuff. So I'm excited about automation stuff because it's kind of new. APIs are part of PowerShell Universal Dashboard, so if you use that, this might feel very similar. And same with dashboards. Like, although we built a bunch of cool stuff in the dashboard, like you'll see that we have some really awesome stuff in the dashboard. What I like about the automation stuff is it's simple. If you've used Universal Dashboard in the past, you may know there's quite the learning curve. So that's why we're trying to focus a little bit on automation, because we see a lot of people building similar things in Universal Dashboard that I think we could kind of solve in automation. And we'll talk a little bit more about that with our 1.6 time frame. And I have an example of some stuff that we're kind of focusing on there. But for the purpose of this demo, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to kind of show off some of the integration points that we have with PowerShell inside of PowerShell Universal and our automation scripts. So the first script that I'm going to create, I'm just going to call get service. So as you can see here, we have a bunch of options. You can set things like descriptions. You can disable people from actually invoking it outside of a schedule, that kind of thing. You can actually select your environment. By default, it's going to run in my 7.1 environment, but you can also set it to run in Windows PowerShell. So you kind of define that per script. You can define it per schedule, or you can even define it every time you run the job. So I'm just going to set that to default. And that is going to create a script. And all I'm going to put inside this particular job is a get service call. So if I just save that and run it, you can see here I have the option to select environment again. And this is actually going to run the script. What it does is it actually starts up an external PowerShell process and runs your PS1 file in that process. And then we have a custom PowerShell host that will pick up on lots of stuff like output and pipeline output and errors. I'll show you some other integration points here in a second. But as you can see here, this ran get process, or I mean get service, and it output that as you would see it in the PowerShell console. But the other thing that we store is actual pipeline output. So if you go to the pipeline output view, you're going to actually see the objects themselves. And if you click this little plus button, it's actually going to allow you to look at all the different properties of those objects. So we take that pipeline output, use the PowerShell serializer to store it as CLI XML, and then you can actually use our PowerShell module or our management API to retrieve this CLI XML and pass it to other PowerShell things. So then you have like a rehydrated object, more or less, that represents, for example, these services. So you could actually access the properties of these services. So it's a little more robust than just accessing text that you see in some other places. All right, the other place that we integrate with in terms of like PowerShell-y stuff are parameters. So I think this is not quite a new concept. This definitely existed in PowerShell Universal. I know like I think WebGea did this, that kind of thing. But the idea is that you can define a param block. And then within your param block, you can define your parameters. And we actually use static code analysis. So there's the PowerShell AST, which allows you to kind of like break apart a PowerShell script. And, it's the same thing that the PowerShell engine is using when it is evaluating the script for runtime, that kind of thing, or what PS Script Analyzer uses to evaluate, syntax and stuff in a script. We use that to look at the param block and determine what parameters we should show to the user when executing the script. So we actually look at things like mandatory parameters, the help message, and then the type of parameter that you're passing in. So if I click run here, what you're going to see is that we actually have kind of a customized parameters dialog based on your param block. So you can see here that this one's required. And then if you hover over different things here, you'll see that the help message is popping up. And then from there, if I actually go through and select some stuff, you'll see that based on the type of parameter, it's actually giving me a different input. So the string was just a text box. The date and time is actually a date field and a time field. And then the day of week, since it was a system.dayofweek, provides you with all the options for that enumeration. So we have a bunch of different different types of data types that we support, but we're always kind of looking for what people are really using. It looks like we're going to be adding some like file upload, credential support, that kind of thing. So if I click run here, it's actually going to take those values that I passed in and then just output them, because that's pretty much what I did in the script. Is I just output each one of the parameters. You can see I typed in test, I selected Tuesday, and I arbitrarily selected Tuesday at 8:06, which is I think just right now. So that's kind of how we integrate with parameters. And this is an example of something we saw people doing a lot of in PowerShell Universal Dashboard. So we're trying to like make this more robust so people can, attack this kind of problem easier, like providing a form that people can enter some stuff and execute their PowerShell scripts without actually having to like manually execute a PowerShell script. So that's just kind of where we're going for with that. All right, one final kind of cool integration. I don't know how much people actually use this, but I think it's cool. It's the feedback integration. So for example, here, I am going to use read host to actually try to read something. So if you were to run this in something like Azure DevOps or something like that, the script is not going to work because there's no way to provide feedback to that script that's running on the CI environment or something like that. And what we did with PowerShell Universal is like, okay, if you have a PowerShell script, you shouldn't have to like modify it necessarily. So we actually integrated with read host so that if you actually run this script, what's going to happen is, you have no parameters to enter here. And then when you go to run it, and it hits that read host, it actually is going to stop on this response to feedback, or the script kind of enters this waiting on feedback state. And you can click that, and you'll see that even the message that I put on read host is there. And I can type into that, and the script will continue. So we do have ways to set up triggers to notify you when a job enters this state and that kind of thing. But yeah, so I think that's kind of a neat integration that we have that allows you to respond to feedback. And what's cool about this as well is if other commandlets that you don't expect to require feedback, like not necessarily read host, require feedback, this will still work. So it'll still pop up some message and ask for feedback if that's the case. All right, the final thing that I want to show off in terms of jobs is just scheduling, because that's what most people do. And what I'm going to do here is, what we see a lot of people doing is like creating scheduled reports, that kind of thing. So I'm going to use the set PSU cache to pretty much set a cache variable inside PowerShell Universal, and I'm just going to set it to this particular value here. And when I run this, it's actually going to set that cache variable if I didn't mess up that command. And what the cache does in PowerShell Universal is it's like a server-wide cache that's stored inside the web server, and you can define all kinds of things like when it invalidates the cache and all that kind of thing. But it also means you can use it throughout the web server. So if I were to create a new endpoint called cache, say okay, then we edit this, and now if I do get PSU cache key visual data, save that and run it, you can see that this was created at this time from the job ID 4. So I just kind of passed in the job ID. So the idea would be that you could run something on a schedule, and you could see that could be like a really long running process or something like that, and it generates a report or whatever, and it's really fast now because it's actually stored in memory inside PowerShell Universal. So to actually schedule that, I can go to the schedules tab here, click a new schedule, select my script to schedule, and then we have like several options. You can do simple schedules, which are just more or less cron schedules that we defined to make it really easy. Like I want to run it every minute, every 30 minutes, every night, Saturdays at midnight. Or you can do a continuous schedule, which will run a schedule with a delay in each run. So, it might, wait 5 minutes between each run, but then it just keeps running, and it won't overrun itself because it just waits for the previous one to finish. We have the cron schedule if you want to get real fancy, and then a one-time schedule if you want to just kind of schedule it to run in the future. So we could just set this one to run every 5 minutes, and it's going to show its next execution, and you're going to start to see the jobs show up in this jobs table here, with information about each one of those jobs of it updating that cache. All right, so that's kind of the basics of our automation feature. Let's talk a little bit about dashboards. So this is still like an extremely popular part of the product. Lots of people are building dashboards. We get lots of questions, mostly because, like I said, there's a learning curve. You can do a lot with it. It's very customizable. If you haven't used Universal Dashboard before, I definitely would suggest going out and looking at some of my previous videos on like YouTube and stuff like that about some of the intricacies of it all and that kind of thing. But I'm going to show some examples of some things that you can do with it. And I won't get too into it, but just to give you kind of a taste of what Universal Dashboard is capable of. So I'm going to click Create New Dashboard here. And you have some options. I'm just going to name this dashboard. And then you have a URL that you can visit. So you get multiple dashboards underneath your PowerShell Universal instance. If you want to just kind of replace the default login location, you can just do this. Or you can have like a nested URL like this. You again can select your environment. So if you want to run in PowerShell 7 or Windows PowerShell, you can do that. And then you can select your framework. So 2.9 is the same framework that we had in the PowerShell module. So if you are migrating from that, and you don't really want to upgrade all your scripts, you can do that. Otherwise, I would suggest our new V3 module, which is, I think, a lot more robust and has a lot of more controls and that kind of thing. And if you select latest, it's just going to use whatever the latest version is inside PowerShell Universal. I'm going to turn on auto start and auto deploy. So auto start will start the dashboard every time the server starts, and auto deploy will redeploy the dashboard every time I make a change. What it's actually going to do is start up a dashboard in the background as a PowerShell process. So if I click this, you're going to see that eventually this dashboard will load. And now I have my dashboard. So it's just hello world. It's got a button. You can switch between light and dark, that kind of thing. And the way this is defined is if you look at the info for this dashboard, I just have some PowerShell script, and we have a bunch of PowerShell commandlets. Like there's tons of documentation and examples on how to use these, but we have all different kinds of controls for buttons and typography, tables, charts, all kinds of stuff. So definitely check those out. Additionally, inside our inside here, we actually have a bunch of samples. So if you want to check out these different samples, we do have some samples that you can use for your dashboard itself directly inside the Visual Studio Code extension. But I'm going to show you a couple things. The first thing I'm going to do is show you charts. So we have several component libraries that come pre-installed with PowerShell Universal. What we do is we have these component libraries, and you actually have to add them to your dashboard. This is primarily a performance thing because you don't want to load a bunch of different components that you're not using. So I'm going to actually add this charts library to my dashboard. And once that's added, I'm actually going to just grab some script that I have here. And this is going to create two charts. The first chart is going to call get process to return all the processes. Then it's going to sort the processes by CPU descending and get the top processes using CPU more or less. Then it's going to create a chart.js chart. So we have a couple different chart libraries that we work with. It's going to create a bar chart, and then it's going to set the pretty much the X and Y axis to the CPU and process name, so that you can kind of see which processes are using the most CPU on this machine. The second thing is an auto refreshing chart. So one concept that we have in UDV3 is dynamic regions. So I'm actually going to define a dynamic region that refreshes every 5 seconds with just some random data, and then put it in a bar chart. But this is going to be using the Nevo chart library, which is just a different look and feel. It does have a lot more options, but sometimes it seems like it's harder to work with. So we kind of offer both. So if I save that, you're going to see a little pop-up that says it updated and deployed the dashboard, and then it's going to automatically refresh the dashboard if I have it open in a tab. So you can see here, of course, Teams is using the most CPU right now. For some Teams, and Teams. And I don't know why Explorer, Dropbox, and Skype. I didn't even know I had it open. And this is an example of kind of an auto refreshing chart. So this is using the Nevo library. And one thing to note about Universal Dashboard is it actually takes advantage of the Facebook's React kind of library for JavaScript. And because of that, things like this kind of just work where it has like cool animations and that kind of thing. So we do offer like a bunch of integrations with stuff like this where we have actual transitions and that kind of thing. So if you want to kind of add some flair to your dashboard, you can do that. So this is just, auto refreshing with random data in the Nevo chart library. And this is the chart.js library up here. All right, so another thing that I want to show in terms of dashboards are forms. So like I said before, that's why one reason we're kind of focusing some of our effort on automation is that we want to make it easier for people to create forms, because a lot of people create forms in Universal Dashboard, but I'll just kind of show you some examples of that. And you can kind of see like you definitely need to build the form with the Universal Dashboard commandlets, unlike with Universal Automation, where it kind of just looks at your param block. So this is an example of a form with a text box and a checkbox. And then it has an onSubmit event handler is what we call it. And that is called whenever I submit this form. And every time I submit it, you're going to get this event data returned to your submit script block, and you're going to get access to whatever the user typed into the form. So if we save this, it's going to automatically update my dashboard. And you can see I have a very simple form with a text box and a checkbox. So there's tons of customization you can do here. You can add labels, you can change like how this checkbox looks, you can change colors and all that kind of stuff. But this is like a very bare and simple example. And if I click submit here, you're going to see that those values that are popping up on the right over here are actually the values that I am clicking or entering into my form. And I'm just using show UD toast to kind of pop up that value there. All right. And if you are a former Universal Dashboard user, one thing I want to show is kind of this is very similar to what you could do in Universal Dashboard, but this is something you couldn't do in Universal Dashboard, and that is the, did I mess this up? I don't think I'm missing a, I guess we'll see. Oh, maybe I didn't. I got too many. All right. You can actually customize the layout of the form, and you can nest controls in the form. You can get very complicated with your form. So in this example, I'm setting up rows and columns. I'm adding a lot more text boxes, that kind of thing. And if I save this form, you'll see that I was able to actually customize the entire layout of the form, so that things appear in rows and columns, and you can kind of move things around and that kind of thing. So very similar to my previous form, I can enter things. I've actually added labels onto my form. So yeah, that's just an example of a far more complex form. So like I said, you can go really bonkers with some of this stuff inside Universal Dashboard. All right. One thing I want to show off, I hope this works, is custom components. So there's actually a pretty big component marketplace. If you actually go to marketplace.universaldashboard.io, you're going to find a lot of these components that people have created. I started creating some specific components for various types of technologies like Active Directory, Windows, Hyper-V, and Azure. In this example, I actually want to use a SQL component. And in PSU, you can actually install these components directly from the management console here. And what that's actually going to do is download a PowerShell module using install or save module from the PowerShell gallery. And that's where all our marketplace modules are coming from. So it's actually synchronizing with the PowerShell gallery and picking up on various tags in the PowerShell gallery. So once you have your, you click install, you're going to have that module available here. And then you can use these kind of custom components in your dashboards. So some components are built with JavaScript and PowerShell. For example, this component is not, it's just built with just a PowerShell script. So I'm going to add that SQL component to my dashboard. And what the idea with this SQL library is that it uses DBA tools actually to do some SQL queries and that kind of thing. And then we built some components around that to make it really easy. So PowerShell Universal Dashboard has a really robust table, but you have to do a lot of work yourself. If you use this new UD SQL table component, you can just pass in some really basic stuff like the columns that you want, the query that you want, the count query that you want to run, where your SQL instance is. It accepts credentials and that kind of thing. So let's see if that works. All right, so now it's loading my podcast for my SQL instance. And it may or may not work. Uh-oh. Oh, there we go. All right, so what this is actually doing is, although it's just kind of showing a table based on a SQL query, it's actually doing a lot of other things. So you'll notice that, for example, we're only showing 5 records here, but the count is 14. That's because it's doing additional queries to check the count on the table. When you do things like filtering, it's actually filtering at the server level rather than filtering inside PowerShell. So it's fast. This could support, I don't know, hundreds of thousands, millions of rows, depending on your SQL server. Sorting, searching, paging is all done on the SQL server. So, and that is why you would use something like a custom component like this, so you don't have to write all that yourself. All right, so that kind of brings me to the end of my PowerShell 1.5 kind of demo here. So we kind of went over APIs, automation, and dashboard. We didn't get into a lot of stuff like customizing environments, authentication, authorization. So definitely a lot more there. But if you wanted to just get started, everything I showed you today, you don't need a license or anything for. You can just install this and play with it. And the only limit I think we have is like the number of jobs you can run per day. Other than that, we just limit like authentication more or less for these. So you can still log into the admin console. It's just that APIs and dashboards won't have authentication. But all right, so now I just want to pop over and show you guys a sneak peek of where we're headed with the PowerShell Universal 1.6 admin console and some of the role-based access stuff that we're going to be doing. So if we go to my 8080 instance here, you can see this is their new login page. I'm just going to log in here. And we've more or less rebuilt this entire admin console. So one of the problems that you don't notice when you're running the admin console locally with PowerShell 1.5 is that it's actually very, very large. It's about 25 megabytes of JavaScript that gets downloaded. That's no longer the case. 1.6 does a much better job of only sending down what you need, that kind of thing. So it'll be much faster, especially over a network. The other thing that I think I've gotten more comments on than anything is that there is dark mode now. So you can just select that dark mode toggle. It'll actually store it in session state. So the next time you load it up, it's going to be dark still. We've done some like organization to split out settings and security since they're kind of two different things. We've added support for tags. So eventually you'll be able to tag all kinds of resources inside PowerShell Universal, but right now we're just using it for scripts. So you can see here that I have an HR tag and an IT tag. And in my automation, I actually have this new user script that's tagged for HR, new mailbox that's tagged for IT. And the idea is, one is for kind of organization. So you can see that I'm organizing based on those tags. The other is for actual access controls. So the other big thing that we're doing for PowerShell Universal 1.6 is access controls for scripts. So if I log in as Adam instead of admin, what you're going to see here is that he's not part of any like built-in groups, the admin or Adam user. He only has access to this this tag IT. So his experience inside PowerShell Universal is a lot more simple. There's no settings or security or APIs or endpoints or anything like that. All he has are the scripts and the jobs. So he has access to do whatever he wants with this script, but he does not have access to that other HR script. So this is a really big ask from a lot of people, was some way to make it more approachable for like a self-service and that kind of thing. So that's kind of the idea here, is you'll be able to have your admin users kind of dole out who gets what scripts, and then you can actually modify the access controls at a very granular level. So you can actually take away the ability to edit this script or delete this script and make it so they can only invoke the script. And then from there, they can only see jobs based on scripts that they actually have access to. So like I said, eventually this is going to kind of roll out throughout the rest of the product. So you'll be able to tag certain certain features within inside PowerShell Universal, and then allow users to access just those things. So so that's our kind of up and coming 1.6 release. Like I said, beta 2 is out shortly after beta 1 to fix some bugs. So we'll keep rolling out betas of this. So you can definitely go to our downloads page. It's actually available right here. We don't have Docker instances or anything like that for this. It's just gonna come down as a zip or an MSI depending on what you're doing. Yeah, so I think that kind of completes it for my demonstration today. So I really appreciate everybody kind of paying attention that whole time. And if you have any questions, I am more than happy to field those now, or show anything else that you might be interested in inside here.
Yeah, I had a question. So when I'm running the Universal and you showed the marketplace where you can install from the PowerShell gallery, what if I was using like Azure with my own private artifacts for PowerShell modules for my company, and I wanted to install that. Is that something that's possible?
Not right now. We haven't asked that. Planning on doing is we do have Git integration, so the idea there is that you could then check in your custom modules directly into your Git repository that also configures PowerShell Universal. So that would be one way to do it. And that's for components that are like specific to dashboards, I guess. If you're looking for like integration with, I guess, other modules, we don't really have a story there yet, but I'd be really curious to understand more about that. So I would say either open up a forum post or a GitHub issue on our issue tracker, and we can kind of talk about what you'd like there. All right, anybody else?
I think I saw a question earlier in the chat about the API feature. Yeah, it was, can
There
you
we go.
edit
Thank
the
you for
response
reminding me.
headers?
Sorry, say again?
That was my question. I'm sorry. I was trying to scroll up to remember what I had asked. Can you modify the response headers?
Can you yes, you can. So we have a special command called new PSU API response or something like that. And that gives you a lot more control of what's returned. By default, if you just kind of return an object, it just returns it as like application JSON and that kind of thing. But if you use that commandlet, you can set response headers and cookies. You can pass down binary data, that kind of thing. So it gives you a lot more control.
I have another question if someone else doesn't have any.
Yeah, go for it.
Can your dashboards use a hierarchy similar to the REST API, where you would have a dashboard that would link? Think of using like a reporting style dashboard where you're drilling down into deeper and deeper levels using URL either. Geez, I don't remember the term for it. Either further levels in the URL or parameters in it.
Yes. So what we support there are within the dashboards themselves, you can define multiple pages. And then those pages can have this, they actually use the same route parameters, or in the same syntax as the APIs in terms of route parameters. So you could do like the colon ID, and that would go to a page that would get that variable. And then you could, modify the page based on what that URL was. So it's a similar concept to the API. Material and how to accomplish. So the question was, there's so much to this, and are there tutorials or training material on how to use it to accomplish certain tasks? So we are working through this. I think one of the big problems we had when we first released PowerShell Universal was there's so much UD stuff out there that people were having a hard time, discerning which documentation to use. So the big thing is definitely look at my YouTube channel, because I am starting to build out videos. I think I made like 12 videos last month or something like that about various portions of UD and PSU, as well as we have these components, all the ones that like the SQL component, for example, are all up on a Git repo. So we're trying to build out kind of like solution specific components. So not only will you be able to just kind of use something like I did here with the SQL table, but you'll also be able to use it as an example if you want to build something more custom. And then like I mentioned earlier as well, as we do have the examples inside the samples folder in the Visual Studio code extension. So I'm always open to feedback on the documentation, and it's like, I don't know, I feel like it's a very difficult thing to like get every use case, and we spend a lot of time in the docs, but I realize that like pouring through the docs isn't always the best way to learn something. So trying to find the best ground there. So yeah, documentation is definitely a living document. So constantly updating that. Every time I have a new customer issue, I try to put it on the documentation somewhere so that people can run into it later. I think the thing that I update the most is IIS hosting documentation. So if you ever have IIS hosting questions. Do you have any real-world scalability numbers for the REST API? So we've done some performance kind of testing, and the REST API will serve about 1,000 requests a second if on an empty request on a, I think it was an 8-core machine with 16 gigs of memory. So where we kind of run into the bottleneck is CPU and available run spaces, and it's just kind of a PowerShell thing. So if you're going to scale above that, you might have to start to think about, distributing horizontally, sort of thing. So, but keep in mind with the REST API, it totally depends what you're doing with your PowerShell scripts. So that is with a bare request, pretty much opening a run space, executing nothing, and then returning an HTTP result. So yeah, that's about where it's at.
Speaking of IIS and such, do you allow any sort of basic authentication methods in the free version? Like if we throw it behind standard Windows authentication just to limit the people who can access the site in general?
Yeah, we don't stop you from doing anything like that. So if you had like Windows Auth in front of IIS hosting this, they would still have to auth at least to get to the dashboard, that kind of thing. You just won't be able to define any role-based access or anything like that. The admin console itself, though, is always authenticated, free version or not. Whatever authentication you set up, it's going to enforce that.
So how do you prevent... Okay, when you're talking about doing tags, I noticed you had the ability for your sample user in IT to delete a tag, delete a script. I'm assuming that they can also create scripts just under the specific tags they're limited to.
Yeah, it totally. Right now, we're kind of working through the details of that. It's still kind of beta thing, but right now, the way that it's currently in the beta, if you were to download it now, you could potentially give a user the ability to create scripts, and if they didn't put a tag that they are allowed to access on that script, it wouldn't show up, but potentially other users could. So we need to implement that still. But the idea would be that, yeah, if you have a role, or if you have access granted through a tag, then you would be required to put that tag on a script when you created it, kind of thing. So yeah. But yeah, like I said, it's very granular in terms of the access controls that you can define. So for example, if you wanted to provide a user with just the ability to execute scripts under that tag, they wouldn't have the ability to delete them or edit them or anything like that. So
will you have some system in place to prevent them from accessing other people's resources?
Yeah, so all that is done at the API level. So we not only do we kind of adjust the UI based on their access controls, but on the API level, they will not even be able to invoke that from there. So you won't be able to look at jobs or dashboards or scripts, that kind of thing. So yeah. Oh, where do you add a certificate for HTTP calls? So some of our settings are in our app settings.json file. So a lot of the stuff that is kind of required at startup, like HTTP certificates or the port, where the data is stored is actually stored in an app settings.json file that you can then set your certificate and that kind of thing. So we have some examples on the docs on how to set a certificate using that app settings.json file. And yeah. One thing that we did add in 1.6 that is not totally obvious is we have a plugin system now. So what we're looking for there is like not shipping so much code with Universal itself, but being able to kind of plug in things like we have a lot of customers looking for SQL Server support. So we want to be able to allow people to swap out the built-in database for SQL Server support. Any plans to expose a PowerShell command to make that easier? Make what easier? Certificates? Oh yeah, messing with app settings JSON can be fun. Yes. Yeah, there's a couple places that we're looking to improve the experience. Yes, one being app settings.json, especially it's very easy to mess that up. The other is IIS. Like we need some way to like deploy to IIS and validate settings inside IIS. So we're thinking about ways to do that. One of the things that we want to get out of app settings.json are all the authentication settings. Because one thing you'll notice inside Universal is if you go to the security and you actually go to the authentication tab, the only thing in here is forms. But we should be able to put like, other authentication things in here. It's just that we need to be able to reconfigure that on the fly, more or less. And then doing that would allow us to do things like validate those settings and that kind of thing. So it'd be a lot more difficult to mess things up and shoot yourself in the foot. All right. Well, if no one has any other questions, a couple things that I want to point out for people. If you do start messing with PowerShell Universal, definitely go to our forums. It's very active, and there's lots of people, asking questions and stuff like that. So pop on there and ask some questions, share what you're working on. I'm always posting stuff about, things like this or videos I've released and that kind of thing. So you can get more information on how to do this. And downloads are available here. So definitely pull the latest Universal version. If you are playing with 1.6, definitely let me know if you run into issues. We have an issue tracker on GitHub that's just Ironman Software/issues, where we're tracking all kind of public customer facing issues. So definitely pop on there and report anything you may find. There are some known issues with 1.6, but it's pretty solid where it's at right now. So I definitely would say give it a try. Yeah, and if you want to just hit me up on Twitter, I just at Adam Driscoll. That's probably one of the better ways to get a hold of me immediately. So feel free to do that as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that presentation. I think this is one of the most highly requested presentations that we've had in a long time. So cool. I think that speaks to the very high frequency that you have for updating this. I've seen it evolve a lot over the years, just over Twitter alone. So that speaks to the impact that it's had to the PowerShell community. So thank you for coming to demo it for us.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I am going to stop the recording now.